The sign-in code for this presentation is 7109.
So we'll just go ahead and get started. And of course, Dr. Sarah will be monitoring the chat too. So our summary and our research that this is based on today, just to give you an idea of where we are. Based on that title, there's a lot we could do with it. So just kind of narrow it down. So we're going to work on using assessment to identify strengths and weaknesses, planning skill acquisition programs, identify related operants on the VB map specifically, but this can be used for other programs as well. Identify when to modify a skill acquisition program, design protocol modifications using client strengths, and plan for generalization. And there are 2 articles here that are included in the invite for this training, so you should have access to them, and I'll be referencing these. You may also be familiar with peak or relational frame theory. Those are all similar to what we're talking about. We're going to apply this to the VB map today. So for any RBTs that are involved and our BCBAs that are involved tonight, I wanted to make this relevant for everyone. So here's our task list skills for RBTs. Skill acquisition, this is what you're doing all day. So these are things that you might see under skill acquisition. C1, identify the essential components of a written skill acquisition plan. C4, implement discrete trial teaching procedures. C5, implement naturalistic teaching procedures or incidental teaching. C8, implement stimulus control transfer procedures. C9, implement prompt fading procedures. And C10, implement generalization and maintenance procedures. And for BCBAs, assessment. F4, conduct assessments of relevant skills, strengths, and deficits, exactly what we're talking about. And selecting and implementing interventions. H6, monitor client progress and treatment integrity. And H7, make database decisions about the effectiveness of the intervention and the need for treatment revision. And that's where we're going to spend most of our time talking about that. And of course, then we have our ethics for RBTs, responsibilities in providing behavior technician services. 2.06, RBTs direct any questions or concerns that they or others, caregivers or coworkers have about their behavior technician services to their supervisor. And under this, I would say ideas, because that's what we're talking about. And for the BCBA, 2.14, selecting, designing, and implementing behavior change interventions. Behavior analysts select, design, and implement behavior change interventions that 1, are conceptually consistent with behavioral principles. 2, are based on scientific evidence. 3, are based on assessment results. 4, prioritize positive reinforcement procedures. And 5, best meet the diverse needs, context, and resources of the client and stakeholders. Behavior analysts also consider relevant factors, risks, benefits, and side effects to the client and stakeholder preference, implementation efficiency, and cost effectiveness, and design and implement behavior change interventions to produce outcomes likely to maintain under naturalistic conditions. They summarize the behavior change intervention procedures in writing, which is our behavior plan. And then 2.18, just the first part, continual evaluation of the behavior change intervention. Behavior analysts engage in continual monitoring and evaluation of behavior change interventions. If data indicate that desired outcomes are not being realized, they actively assess the situation and take appropriate corrective action. Part 2, when a behavior analyst is concerned that services concurrently delivered by another professional are negatively impacting the behavior change intervention, the behavior analyst takes appropriate steps to review and address the issue with the other professional. And we would review and change anything that we identify that needs to be changed. Mostly we'll focus on the first part. So for all of our RBTs who may not be familiar, basic VB map and verbal operant, so we're all on the same page. This is an example of the VB map scoring form and the different skills that you're used to teaching if you're doing anything with your current clients. The VB map assessment is testing receptive, which is no talking. You don't have to talk to be able to respond to a receptive task, and then expressive, which would be some kind of way of communicating, and usually with words is what we're talking about today. So under receptive, we have listener responding, visual perceptual skills and match to sample, VPMTS, listener responding by function, feature, and class, LRFFC, motor imitation, and play, which would be alone play. Most of those just require some kind of a gestural response to be able to tell that they're listening. And then expressive, vocalizing words, mands, requesting, tact, labeling, echoic, repeating, interverbal, conversational skills, and social, play with others. There's, in the example of the VB map, level 1 roughly coincides with age 1, level 2 roughly coincides with age 2, and level 3 roughly coincides with age 3 as far as developmental skills. And they get more complex as they go. So jumping over to some research about the VB map, we often use the VB map to assess those operants separately. And so this research is looking into how much weight should be put on those operants separately versus independently of each other versus together. This is a lengthy article. It is part of what was sent out with this training. But I wanted to just jump to the conclusion of this article. So exploratory factor analysis of the VB map, support for the interdependency of elementary verbal operants. So the conclusion of this article, after all the research they did, is that the verbal operants are interdependent, meaning they develop together. So interdependence of verbal operants. Quote, our results failed to provide support for the interdependency of verbal operant categories of the VB map. For example, performance on level 1 tact items was more likely to be related to performance on level 1 mand items than level 2 tact items. Therefore, the results support that the other operants appear to be interdependent as a broader areas of skill development. Recommendations, quote, this has potential implications regarding how educators go about establishing the verbal operants. As a learner's performance on assessments such as the VB map improves, it may be the case that targeting single operants is less efficient than targeting multiple operants in order to build verbal complexity. And that's Bell Isle, 2021. So examples that you as a BCBA may already be doing, and some of the RBTs may already be doing, tact to man transfer, tact to intraverbal transfer, echoic to man transfer. You're using those interdependently to teach new skills. So I'm not bringing a lot of new things today, but just maybe some new ideas on how to apply this. DTT decision making. So here's some other research when you're doing DTT. This is a very very good article I would highly recommend to any student analysts or any new analysts that maybe are not familiar with this article. It's really great for that decision making that you need to do when you just discover I need to make a change in a program. Where do I go from here? So this is a model for problem solving and discrete trial training for children with autism. Both practitioners often recognize or suspect that a child with autism is not making progress in an instructional program for teaching a specific skill. Without effective and timely troubleshooting, they risk compromising their intervention. If, for example, an unnecessary decision is made to stop a program, the child is deprived of the learning opportunity. If, on the other hand, an ineffective program is continued, the practitioner risks frustrating the child and wasting time. Systematic troubleshooting, this is what this article covers. Data from 8 to 10 sessions to determine progress. This is what they recommend. And there's a very good set of decision tree charts where you can look to see and answer yes, no questions to determine where you need to go with your program. So common problems that this article covers: no skill acquisition, inconsistent performance, failure to generalize, and lack of motivation. Strategies for modifications referenced in this article, including changing prompts, modify error correction, increased reinforcement, video modeling, incidental teaching and chaining. So there's all good things in this article. And this also supports ways that you can do other things to work on increasing motivation. So some application from what we've talked about so far. My goal is to give enough to where this can be applied starting tomorrow. I think it's great to have some good research and have some resources, but sometimes you just need to be able to take it and run. So that's my goal today, is to switch from what we just did to kind of lay the groundwork to now here's some application of what we're talking about. So once you have your VB-MAP assessment filled out, here's an example of one that is based off of a client, but not the actual report. Identify strengths and weaknesses. That's your first step, of course. And so here's an example relative to other areas. The strengths for this particular client are VPMTS, matching, visual skills, play, reading, and echoic. And under reading, of course, is basic identification of letters. And then relative weaknesses are MANS, social, imitation, LRFC, or LRFFC, and intraverbal. So here's some examples of where to start and how to get there. Design or modify programs with strengths in mind that teach across the operands to boost emerging skills. So we're going to look at this particular example and see how that might work. So related and interdependent operants. So we're going to look and use the stronger operant that they have a skill in to then transfer to the weaker operant. So if I want to teach tacts, I'm going to look and see, do they have that echoic? And most of us are already doing this, where you're going to use those echoic skills to then transfer over to teach a tact or a MAND. So that's what we're talking about. So echoic to tact, echoic to MAND, then maybe tact to MAND, VPMTS to MAND. So a picture exchange communication system works off of that. Listener to tact. So this one maybe is less common, but basically that's what you're teaching, is that receptive skill first, and then you're going to transfer it to tact. So for example, I have a client right now working on just increasing those listener skills and identifying the 40 new items. We are probing those same ones in tact as well. So those programs look like we run listener responding the way you would normally. Well, we're also going to probe TACT as a cold probe the next day to see if they're learning it across the operants, using the same materials at first, but then eventually work towards generalization. And then there's alone, play alone to social play. So you're less likely to play socially if you're not playing alone yet. Working towards adding that as a skill. And then LRFFC to introverbal. These sometimes work, just depends on which ones they are. But an example would be if you had an array and you had the car was the correct answer, you could, as long as the introverbal was also the correct answer was car, you could switch back and forth. So that might be an array, and you would say, show me one with wheels, and it would have a car. And then you could also say, what's something that has wheels? And then the introverbal would be a car. So you can transfer that skill over. And then TACT to introverbal as well. Here's an example of one that we did, introverbal. So introverbal, what has wheels? Correct. The child says car. And then the LRFFC would be an array of 8 to 10. What has wheels? Correct. And they select the car. Using the same materials in SD, run LRFFC trials, then transfer to introverbal. Treat the LRFFC like prompts or high P trials, and then fade LRFFC as the client becomes more successful. So you're basically using the LRFFC as a visual prompt. Especially useful for teaching WH questions. Sometimes those can be really tricky. And plan and test for generalization across different materials. Here's play. Here's one that I did a couple years ago. So here's based off a real client, we'll call him Talking Tom. He did not make eye contact with anyone. And he had some social skills, but really paid more attention to his toys more than people. And he had some introverbal skills. So we started with play, we transferred to introverbal, then social. And what that looked like was, here's Talking Tom, we're doing imaginary play, here's his strengths, client strength, imaginary play, vocalizations. Weaknesses, introverbal, social skills, attends to objects more than people. So his social goal was, of course, part introverbal, part social. SD, what is your name? We could not get this to, we could not get a response here for quite a long time. So the problem was he was dependent on error correction, needed a correct prompts to answer, no response in a naturalistic setting, and problem behavior. So the solution, we temporarily moved everything to NET trials only, run trials. What is your name? Using toys and the client's favorite characters, Gummy Bear, Woody, Buzz. So the character play, hi, I'm Woody. What is your name? Client response, eye contact with the character and correct responding in the imaginary play context. So typically this is where you might say, well, it doesn't count because it's not a social skill, it's not with a peer. So yes, that would be correct as far as your data, unless in the data you can show where you are using it as a step towards that direction, and which is what we did. So once the client was consistently responding and contacting reinforcement during play, then successfully transferred it to the social setting. So then we went to his mom and we did the same thing with his mom, asking him what his name was, and then he was able to generalize to other people. So we needed those extra steps, and we just put it into the graph like prompts, and then faded those prompts as he was more successful. Here's another example, introverbal to vocal mand. Here's Wile E. Coyote. His strengths were BPMTS, very strong letter ID, mans with PECs, specific intraverbals. A is for, B is for, C is for. So he had some words, but the only way he would talk to anyone is with this intraverbal prompt. This is what his mom had been working on with him. He did not do anything else. So that's where we started. So he had no functional mans. Those were weaknesses. And vocal mans, attacks, and very weak motivation. So to go for manned SD, what do you want? We had to add A is for, and treat it like an intraverbal. A is for apple. And then the client responds, apple, and then eventually fade the intraverbal to get just a pure manned. Once the client was responding, the intraverbal was faded with successful transfer to the manned, and this was also useful in teaching emerging TATs. So ethical considerations. The behavior analysts summarize the behavior change intervention procedures and writing. That's from the ethics from the beginning. And here's just an example of what that might look like when you're writing it down. Because if you're going to apply this, you would want to somehow document how you're teaching it. So this is how it's written, and hopefully can show that it's not too difficult to write it out as a treatment plan objective. So here's the objective for the one that was working on saying his name. The client will say his name when asked. The goal is 80% of trials, correct for 3 days, then fade prompts and or increase criteria, and generalization across 2 people and settings. So then the procedures just throw in those extra steps that we used to work on the imaginary play and the client's transfer from that to actually saying his name with people. And so then that is just written into the plan, just exactly how we did it. So here's some implementation, and it looks like I've gone very, very fast. So we'll have some time for maybe some discussion here. Implementation for tomorrow. So for an RBT, there's not a lot if you are not responsible for programming for your client, but this is what RBTs are great at. When you're working with a client, you get to see them a lot more than the BCBA. So what client are you working with now that could benefit from this teaching across operants? So ask your BCBA, your feedback is needed and valued. If you have ideas, that's where you really can be valuable. I even put a little example of how you can bring it up. I noticed my client, they are really good at X, whatever that is. Can we use that to help them teach and help them learn new skills? This is a great way to support the learning for your client, but also it makes it more fun for you and for them, because when you do see that a program is taking a while to learn, sometimes it can also not be your most fun or favorite program to teach, as well as for the client, it's probably not very motivating for them. So by modifying it this way and with their strength, they may actually you may find that it becomes your most favorite program to teach because the progress starts to increase. And so for BCBAs, I would recommend start small. This is not something you would do across all of your programs for all of your clients. You would really look at what do you need to modify? And that would be a good place to start with what you're already doing. So steps to start to implement this would refer to your client's last VB map or whatever assessment that you're using, because this can be used with other assessments. Identify strengths that you can use to modify or design a program. pro potential procedural modifications with your client. So just test it out, see if they're going to like it, see if you're going to like the results that you're getting. And plan for generalization once they are contacting reinforcement in the emerging skill. That's really important because we're just getting them boosted, but they still need to be able to do some of these skills without that extra visual support of LRFC or without the extra imaginary play for 5 minutes before they're asked what their name is. And then write your procedures into your plan of what you're doing. Big thing is to celebrate success, because when your client and your RBT find that you're doing that, that's a great way to celebrate that you're being successful. So I see we have a question here. What are some of the best ways to plan for generalization, in your opinion? So in this particular case, for generalization, I want to see that they can learn across materials. If I'm going to teach, for instance, LRFFC and use that to boost the intraverbal response, I want to know that they can do the intraverbal response eventually in isolation without the LRFFC support. Or can they do a new intraverbal that was not directly taught using LRFFC? Because we don't want it to become another way to be prompt dependent. And if anyone wants to have throw in any other questions, we can.
I really like that you mentioned trying to avoid that prompt dependency, because I think that's so easy to fall into, because we get so excited with some of these skills as they're learning them, but we kind of forget to fade the prompt, and then maybe we do it too fast. So what are some ways that we can kind of assess, are we fading appropriately? Is this really helping with the generalization right now?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And what I see a lot of times with the prompt dependency is that we're really good at using all of those programmed prompts that are there, or even a delay, like a 2-second delay is always good. But sometimes when it can be really subtle with those prompt dependency. So some of the ways that I've faded prompts with this particular thing is more when you just can't get past that one, like they still need that gestural prompt, or they still just cannot get past that one level of prompting. So then maybe you're able to fade it by throwing in another way of doing it, maybe a stimulus prompt, maybe some kind of a visual temporarily, just to get them, just get that boost where you're able to get rid of the one that they're so dependent on. In that article that I really highly recommend that anybody reference, the charts are very helpful in identifying what might also be a challenge for prompting and prompt fading. A lot of times it's motivation. If they're just not motivated and you have that client that's kind of like just content to let you physically prompt them through error correction, because they know that after so many error corrections, they're going to get their reinforcer. That's one where I'll tend to look at that if it looks like it's a motivation problem, that maybe the prompt dependence isn't so much that they don't know, it's that they're just content to let you do it so they can get done. And if that's the case, then motivation can sometimes be that, once you've identified that, then what is it, their strength, that is going to help increase that motivation. So sometimes they just need something that's going to be more exciting. Not just that reinforcer at the end, but maybe we need to switch out materials. Maybe they're tired of those materials and they need something that's more exciting. Does that answer that question about prompt fading, or does anybody have anything else they want to add?
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Anyone else who has any questions for Donna, please put them in the chat or just come off mute and ask out loud.
I'd really like to get into the application. If anybody has any examples of maybe a program that you're working on and that you'd like to change up a little bit, we could do that. And I'll also share any other examples that I've used.
I'd love to hear more about like examples of working on that receptive piece. As you mentioned, I think we focus a lot on the expressive, and the receptive can be harder to really identify the progress and what's working and what's not. So I'd love some examples of that. Okay.
So one of the examples that I've used just from very emerging skills, often a lot of my clients are very, very basic level 1, if you know VB map, learning to understand what you're even saying. So often when I have to probe for the receptive, I'm looking to see, do they even understand what the directions are? So like touch house. When you're doing DTT, some of the barrier to even being able to select the correct answer might not be that they don't know that's a picture of a house. They don't know necessarily receptively what you're asking them to do. And so that may end up needing to be a program in and of itself. Often I'll do just DTT procedures as a program so they understand when I say point to, this is what I want you to do. When I say touch, this is what I want you to do. And I say, hand me the card, that's what I want you to do. And we do it to a certain extent. BCBAs are trained to do that, where we teach them hands down and we teach certain things. But sometimes those listener skills, as far as just even understanding what the adult is asking them to do, is a real barrier. And then I'll try to also get some very fun high P targets for listening. So one of them I'll do is like throwing trash away, because what kid doesn't like to dunk something? So we'll do a very basic, here, this is trash. Can you put this in the trash can? They have to listen and then follow that one-step direction to throw trash away. And then once they are dunking it and they are so proud of themselves that they know how to do that, that becomes a high P target for more listening. So then we can do other listening skills that are functional, like you would do with just about any other listening targets that you might have. The receptive programs all are going to be more supportive of those. In the expressive programs, they go together. That's what that article was showing, is that they are going to they're going to be interdependent and they're going to grow together. So if you look at the VB map, it's useful for us to separate those operants, and it's useful for us to report it that way. But what that article was saying is basically, if that client is not strong in an area in tact necessarily in level 1, then your mans are going to be about the same or less than that, because your expressive and receptive are going to be interdependent with each other. So they really should be taught together as much as possible. And it's helpful to use it for reporting when we separate them. And it's helpful to be able to make sure they do know it separately. But I don't think it's critical, because they need to be able to operate across, back and forth, receptive to expressive, and then back. And those are going to support each other. Does that answer the question, Dr. Sarah, about receptive?
Yeah, I think those are some really good examples. Thank you. Donna, of all these different types of skills you've been talking about teaching, which do you find easiest to use this approach, and which do you find most difficult, like to develop the programs that are successful?
That's a good question. I would say the easiest ones are listener responding and tact, because your program, especially if you're following the BB map, you're going to see that the materials can be interchangeable. Very often you can use the same set of materials for listener responding that you use for tact. And that's where you would then program for generalization later after they've learned that set. But to begin with, you're able to teach one, test the other, and see. And if you're familiar with peak, that's a common thing, a common theme. That one's an easy one to do, especially if you're just getting started. VPMTS is for matching, like that's a good strength to be able to build off of. If you have VPMTS, then you're more likely to be able to do PECs. If you're struggling with PECs, look at your client. If they're not really attending to objects and scanning, and look at their results, VPMTS might be lower than you think, and there may be some need to go back and teach those visual skills to be able to get your PECs working better. So that would be one. The other one that might be an easier one to do if your client's really struggling with the intraverbal, if they tend to give you memorized answers with intraverbals, to have an array and do LRFFC and then go right into intraverbal after that. Those are good, easier ones to implement. I find imitation is sometimes harder to teach, especially if they don't have eye contact with adults. And sometimes you need people to help you prompt with imitation. That one's a little bit probably harder across these to teach imitation. And if they don't have social skills as well, sometimes that can be challenging. So for example, in this one that's on the screen, this client has weakness in imitation and social skills. And a lot of that has to do with not making eye contact with others. So if you don't make eye contact, you're not likely to be able to see what they're asking you to do. Any other questions?
Just commenting, I know I put this a bit in the chat, but that eye contact, that basic attending, I feel like it's so easy for us to miss that that's like one of those precursor skills, prerequisite skills that maybe they don't have already. I know that I was working with a kiddo that for like 2 weeks, our biggest thing was just getting him to look where we told him to look. You know, like look at something when we held it in different spots. And the day that he actually stopped to walk around another student instead of walking right into him, we all did a happy dance because he was actually like becoming more aware of his surroundings and paying attention. And there were a lot of skills that he was way behind on in his plan from before. And it wasn't that he couldn't do them. He was just missing that prerequisite skill.
Yeah, I would say that I've had clients that I wish there was a level 1/2, because there were, when you're referring to the BB map, there's certain milestones there that even that is a lot to get someone to. And so when you have kids that are that emergent, where they're functioning at a 9-month-old level in some areas, it really does take going and taking a step back and going, okay, maybe we're not ready to do MANs yet, because we're not even doing visually attending to an adult, or we're not ready to give them a device because someone thinks it's a great idea to give them a device when we're not visually attending. So then you're able to support your assessment and say, this is why they're not ready. And this is what we need to do to get there. So I have actually had a couple clients like this where we spent time just working on attending to an object and attending to a picture, and attending to a face. Not even eye contact, but just attending to a face, because there's so many more things that you need to be able to do with that and back up more, even though it's not there in the VB map, but just looking at it like, okay, we need to find even more smaller stepping stones to make it, to help them be successful. And, we celebrate milestones, but, I call that even the smaller steps, the inch stones. Like, we need to celebrate the inch stones that they make too, because sometimes those are our kids. Like, they're gonna make huge gains for themselves, but what we would call a milestone, they're not hitting yet. And I do try to encourage the parents what that looks like, and we can still celebrate with that.
I know you referenced the PEAK earlier also, and something that I really like about both PEAK and VB Map is on the results, you can see where some of those gaps are. To be able to back up. I love the visual of the results of both of those assessments, depending on where the client is at the time and what you're starting with.
Yeah. And I feel like with that PEAK can be very intimidating for people. So I'm hoping that this is helpful for anybody that's very comfortable with VB Map and you're like, I really would like to do PEAK, but I'm so good at VB Map. If you're one of those people that's kind of in that boat, the research is there. And just because it's a curriculum doesn't mean you can't take the research and say, I'm going to apply it to what I know. And those skills are basically what the research is saying is that language is complex and you need all of that language. You need them interacting together to really develop in each of those areas. If you're just working on tax only, you're going to learn it, but life isn't like that. So you need to be able to be mixing and matching with those skills. And PEAK helps you do that. But it's based on research that can be applied with anything. Yes, PEAK uses a lot. and it uses a lot of good research. That if you're comfortable with it and you're doing it, you're doing a lot of what this training is about.
Any other questions or comments for Donna? This has been a lot of great information. Okay, we've got one here, Donna. It says, in theory, it wouldn't matter the assessment, right? It would just have to be applied a little differently if it were AFLs or something.
Correct. Yes. So a lot of the assessments are based on the, separating out the operant, and there's good reason for doing that, because how else would we talk about MANs and TACs if we didn't separate them? But for the teaching, then yes, you can absolutely teach, we're just talking about using that strength that you identify and then creatively matching it up to that weakness that you think that those are going to go together and they're going to really be able to be motivated. A lot of it has to do with motivation. Be motivated to learn. I'll give an example of one. It was not my client, but someone when I was a colleague, and their client was just into superheroes. So you would have your superheroes as the reinforcer, and okay, we're going to do DTT, and then now you get to play with your superheroes. It just was not working. And so what we ended up doing was pairing the superheroes with the teaching process, which would make sense because you're pairing that reinforcement with the task that they're doing. But we also discovered in that process that the superheroes were not only motivating throughout, but also that client had skills related to the superheroes. They knew everything about the superheroes. So then we could build off of that and go, okay, well, you know this one, you know their name. Okay, well, let's find their name in writing, and let's find their name, and let's find the letter that's in their name. And so then it just expanded into, let's take what you know, and now let's teach this in DTT off of what you know. And that's what this whole thing is based off of.
I feel like we end up learning a lot about random topics such as superheroes, depending on our clients' interests, for sure.
Right, yes. And I see we had another comment here about we can use the same thought process in training staff also and build on their natural strengths and gain skills, yes, and confidence, yeah. I mean, I don't think I've really presented anything that's new. I think it's really just a new way of thinking about it, because sometimes, especially if you're really locked into the VB map and you've been doing it for years, you may just go with, hey, we're going to teach MANS today, or we're going to work on tax, and it's fine. But sometimes you need to be able to mix and match those and feel comfortable that it's okay to do that. So I did have a client that came to me from another agency, and they had been working on the VB map, and they sent a great set of resources. They even sent materials for this client, which is amazing. But when I started looking into what they had for her, she was every week getting another set, like, here's another set of targets. And it was very much pigeonholed into each section. So there were like 10 trials of this and 10, which is very similar to what all of us are used to doing. But it was not fun. And so that's, I think, one of the things that hopefully can get this across for everyone is that if your client is not really very motivated, this can really help, because you can pull from what they actually love, which is their strength, and that's going to help with motivation. And sometimes maybe just working through it till you get done and get that access to that reinforcer at the end just isn't enough. And you need to be able to add something that just gives it that extra oomph to get through what they really don't have a good grasp of. So I want to thank everyone for listening. I feel like I did go a little fast. So if anybody thinks of anything at the beginning or has questions, you can find me on email, and I'm also on Teams. So if you want to reach out, I'd love to support and answer any questions that come up later.
The sign-out code for this presentation is 9267.